okay, that Mass is an immersive experience. He's fully involved. His Mass was very different than other Masses that were performed in that it was lively. It was, you never knew which way it was going to go.
We have some films of those. We've seen Padre Pio saying Mass.
And it's an emotional experience. It's not just the tradition of it. It's not just the ritual of it. It's an entire journey that he goes through. He's exhausted at the other end. He's sweating. He's dripping. He's crying. There's snot. It's like the man went to battle. He went to war. And it feels like there's a death that happens and a resurrection. And it's extremely emotional, which is how he touched people. He didn't touch people through like these profundities that he spit. He was also an immense feeler. A lot of his contemporaries didn't liken him to an Aquinas or an intellectual. He was an extraordinary feeler. He was like a pro-feeler. And that was my first inroad to him, was the fact that I as an actor who feels that way, that I'm not like I didn't go to school. I didn't go to Juilliard. I'm just like a street tough who wound up in this wild world. And in Pio, I found the same kind of misanthrope who wound up in this wild situation where a lot of people put a lot of pressure on him, and he felt the enormous nature of the task. That was my first inroad. Yeah. Sorry for speaking too much.
No.
So actually, I think this is a good point. And from what few parts of the interview that I've seen so far, this does seem to be a common theme in LaBeouf's testimony. I think a really good thing to point out is what was said by Garrigou-Lagrange. And there's a book that Garrigou-Lagrange wrote, The Sense of Mystery, which is a really good book. One of the classics of 20th century Thomistic scholastic thought. But again, I think people who like Aquinas and people who admire Aquinas and people who are in the intellectual tradition of Aquinas, I think they have a reputation for being cut and dry intellectuals who have no emotion. And I think that nowhere in the Thomistic tradition do they say that faith or the knowledge of God is purely intellectual in nature. In fact, Garrigou-Lagrange talks about what he calls the quasi-experiential knowledge of God brought about through the gift of wisdom. So basically, Garrigou-Lagrange believed that there were a few different ways in which you can know God. And the first way in which you can know God is through metaphysical knowledge, which is an understanding of all things in their essences and in relation to their higher cause. So basically what that means is we understand the fundamental nature of a thing. We understand the basic principles that govern a thing's existence, and then we understand how all of that is traceable back to a higher cause, which we call God. And basically, that knowledge of God is obtainable through reason, even apart from faith or divine revelation. But there's another way of knowing God, and that is through the gift of wisdom. And the gift of wisdom, as a spiritual gift, is given to us only through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And wisdom can manifest itself in one of two ways. The first way in which wisdom can manifest itself to us is through the ability to make judgments based on a clear perception of certain moral principles. But another way in which wisdom can manifest itself in our lives, according to Garrigou-Lagrange, is in a manner similar to when one has a particular virtue. The virtues, they dispose us in a particular way. And when you're disposed a particular way by the virtues or by the vices, that, again, the entirety of the human person becomes disposed or inclined that way, including our judgments. So our ability to judge is inclined or disposed in a really real way. Like there's an actual change to our disposition, and so there we become oriented towards a particular object. And basically every virtue has a particular object, and when you have a particular virtue, you're able to make accurate judgments about things that pertain to the object of that virtue. Why a just man is capable of making good decisions about things that accord with justice. A chaste man is capable of making good choices about things that pertain to chastity. A merciful man is capable of making good judgments about those things that pertain to mercy. And that's because when you obtain a virtue, there develops what's called a certain connaturality between you and the object of the virtue. You become intimately connected with it. You become disposed towards it. And that's sort of analogous to one of the ways in which the gift of wisdom can manifest itself to us. This sort of fundamental disposition towards a particular object. And in the case of spiritual wisdom, we become disposed towards a divine end, towards God. And we begin to be filled with a sense of filial love and obedience to God that takes the form of something that we aren't just assenting to intellectually, but which is very viscerally strong. And Garrigou-Lagrange says that one good example of spiritual wisdom is found in the book of Acts, chapter 24, verse 32, after the apostles had been talking with Jesus after the resurrection on the roads to Emmaus, and they didn't recognize him at first. And then Jesus disappears from their presence right after they recognize him. And the text goes on to say that the apostles said, quote, "Is it not true that our hearts burnt within us when you spoke to us on the way and explained the scriptures to us?" Unquote. So, and the thing is, Garrigou-Lagrange expounds upon this, and he goes on to say, and I quote, "From the fact that we now love the revealed mysteries of the incarnation and redemption, there is now in us a relation of conformity of these mysteries to our intimate dispositions, or rather, from our dispositions to the mysteries. Therefore, under the special inspiration of the Holy Spirit, these mysteries appear to us not only as believable, because they were revealed, but also as sovereignly lovable and worthy of a love that ought to become ever purer and ever stronger." Unquote. And again, Garrigou-Lagrange says that this is also something that's pointed to in the 34th Psalm, verse 8. "Taste and see that the Lord is good." So the goodness of God, and therefore his lovability, because don't forget, we love a thing to the extent that it is good, but the goodness of God, and therefore his lovability, is something that we taste it, we see it. It's something visceral. And so I think there's a distinction that needs to be made. We don't judge spiritual experiences based solely on emotions. It's not, I believe, because of what the emotions, because I feel a strong emotion. Rather, according to the traditional Catholic view, and according to St. Thomas, and according to Garrigou-Lagrange, basically, it's not that we judge a spiritual experience based on emotions, but rather we perceive something as true, but in perceiving something as true, we perceive it as good, and therefore we love it. And the more important the good, the stronger the love that it elicits from us. And love isn't just an emotion, but the sense of being in love with a reality, particularly if it's the greatest of all realities, God, that, can't but elicit a strong emotion. And so we're judging the emotions we feel based on what we know or what we have reason to believe is true. And so basically, but feeling a strong emotion and having this very strong, very visceral experience is oftentimes one of the signs that our process of conversion or this process of entering more deeply into a relationship with God, it is really coming along. It's really entering into a deeper phase.